Okay, joining me now is Colonel Cedric Leighton, a member of the Joint Staff under Admirals Mullen and
General Pace.
And so someone who's the kind of guy who understands the big picture issues. Now, the job that you had at the Pentagon was you're part of the think tank for the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Exactly.
So you would prepare memos for them about what are the crisis issues we're facing and what can we possibly do about them, right?
Absolutely. Crisis issues, acquisition problems, the whole 9 yards. Anything that the military touched basically came through us on the Joint Staff, and especially anything related to the unified commanders, such as CENTCOM.
Right, Central Command, right. Most of our audience understands those words.
Right.
But what I wanted to ask you about today, because you've got a real background in cyber and the cyber threats, and I was struck last night at the Republican debates when each of the candidates were asked, what do you think of the big crises problems coming up that you'd have to deal with were you president? And Herman Cain said, I was a ballistic missile analyst, and I think cyber war is the coming problem. Now, this is something you're an expert in. Tell me about it, because Admiral Mike McConnell, former Director of National Intelligence, he says the cyber war has already begun and we're losing.
Well, I think he's right, unfortunately. And part of the problem is a complacency that we see not only within certain public sector elements of the U.S. government, but also within the private sector in U.S. corporations. The way in which these corporations deal with cyber issues really depends a lot on how familiar they are with the threats that are out there. And what we're finding nowadays is that really anything can be targeted, anything can be hacked. Some things are overblown, obviously, but there are a lot of situations where some very key elements of our infrastructure are subject to attack, and there is ample evidence that they have been attacked. Some of this is public knowledge.
Have been attacked or just hacked into?
Well, it depends on how you define attacked and how you define hacked, but generally speaking, most of it is hacking activity. Attacking would mean an active pursuit to actually put malware in there. So something like a Stuxnet type scenario, as far as I know, has not happened yet in the United States. However, there's always the possibility that it could, and that's something, KT, that we have to be very careful of.
So who's doing the hacking? Who's looking into your computer and mine?
Well, it really depends, but there are certain areas where we're pretty certain that they're looking at targeting the United States. China is suspect number one, followed very closely by Russia. There are other countries out there, to include France, Israel, Germany, that have cyber capabilities, not necessarily that they're attacking us or hacking into us or even looking at our networks, but they have the capability to do so. And there are plenty of other nations out there that have nascent cyber capabilities.
So they're looking at us. They're looking at our military, our government, they're looking at our corporations, they're looking at Bank of America, they're looking all over the critical infrastructure, civilian and economic.
Right.
Are we doing the same thing?
Well, we're doing part of that. We don't do as much economic intelligence as other nations do. For example, the French and the Chinese and the Russians have a very clear program within their intelligence services that benefits the economic aspects of their, not only their governmental sector, but also their so-called private sector, their enterprise
which isn't
sector.
so private.
Exactly. It's not so private, and there's not as much of a distinction between state elements and private elements in many of these countries. And in other countries, it's a matter of public policy to provide economic guidance from the government, even if they're nominally capitalist countries like, for example, Germany or France. They have a very active capability within the cyber world where they take a look at different networks. They also provide information that from an industrial espionage standpoint would be very, very useful. That includes how a network is set up, what kind of structures are in that network, how many people use that network, what types of data flow through that network. All of those things, kind of the journalistic who, what, where, when, why, and how of going after a particular target. But the primary folks that are going after us would be the Chinese and the Russians.
And are they just trying to gather information, or are they planting stuff in computer systems to be used at some later date?
There is some evidence that there are aspects that are actually being planted in there. Certain forms of malware, for example, could
take your system down whenever they choose to.
Whenever they choose to, on a specific date or after a specific event, get a central direction from from the people that are running this aspect, and then go in and actually take systems down, or maybe present false data to the system, and that then provides a whole new opportunity not only for intelligence gathering, but in terms of how we respond to that, but also determines exactly how that malware flows through the system, and they can assess how that works from their standpoint. So it's a very significant issue.
Right, and do we defend against this?
We do. Well, we do it through various, I mean, the most simplest way nowadays would be firewalls and other devices, but they're not really adequate to a clear penetration attack. For example, the attack that was reported in Illinois concerning the water plant, that there's now a word that...
So tell me what that was.
Oh, what happened near Springfield, Illinois, there's a...
So Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's birthplace.
Exactly.
Middle America.
Middle America, middle of, not really a normal target like New York City or Washington or San Francisco. But what happened there was, allegedly, they took a look at what was going on with the system and found various pump malfunctions were going on within the water plant, the water treatment facility there. And what happened was that they traced, initially the word was that they traced information that indicated that a Russian server was involved in going after the system. Now, there is word today that that actually may not have happened as we initially thought it did. There may be not enough evidence to say it's a Russian server. It may have been a Russian server that was hijacked by somebody else, and in some reports indicate that the attack did not take place as originally reported.
Okay, so in other words, this wasn't just, oops, somebody just goofed up and the computer, this was somebody has gone into the water system in Springfield, Illinois, and has done bad things to it. We just don't know who.
That's right, and that's the way these cyber attacks work, KT. They go in, and it's very hard to provide attribution to these attacks.
So you don't know who to retaliate against.
Exactly.
You don't know who to track down and get mad at.
And that makes the offensive component of any U.S. cyber strategy very, very difficult to achieve, because if you don't know who to go after, you won't know exactly what the scale of your attack should be. If it's just a lone attacker who is using another server as a proxy, you don't want that to be the start of potentially World War III. So you have to be very, very careful with attribution and how you go about that.
The thing that has struck me in all my reading about it is how extremely vulnerable the United States is. I mean, it's everything from, you get up in the morning, you have a cup of coffee that you've heated with electricity, you get in your car, you drive to work, you do some emails, you surf the internet, you leave the office, you go home, and on your way home you stop at the bank and get some money out, you go to the grocery store and get some stuff off the shelf, you come home and watch TV. And every one of those things are subject to cyber attack, and none of them are protected because none of them are in the military realm.
They're not in the military realm, and they're not encrypted in many cases. Now, we've upgraded our encryption capabilities within the private sector considerably. For example, most Wi-Fi networks nowadays require a password to get in. So that's at least the start of an encrypted protocol. But even those are hackable or penetratable. And that's one of the key things to know about this is even if people are not going after the data that you are using or that you're accessing, they know where you are. They can tell where you are. They can tell where your movements are. The minute that you keep something on, some electronic device of any kind.
Right, they can track you, right? The GPS goes two ways.
Exactly. It can go it goes two ways, and part of that is for billing purposes. Part of it is also to be used so that in event of an emergency, the emergency responders can find you. But that means that there's a vulnerability. So, for example, OnStar systems, the GM OnStar system.
Yeah, those commercials.
Exactly. And it's a wonderful system. It's a wonderful system, and other companies have similar things like BMW and Volvo have similar systems in certain markets. Each of those systems is potentially vulnerable, and that could mean that you could send different ones and zeros, unintended ones and zeros to your car's computer, and that could make all kinds of things go wrong. So there are certain potential vulnerabilities out there that we have to safeguard against, but we can't surrender. These are the kinds of things that are it's very, very important to realize what the vulnerabilities are, but to work toward fixing them and not go into a mode where
oh my gosh, we're going to go back, pre-electricity, we're not going to drive our cars, we're not going to turn on the television.
The Stone Age should not be an option for us.
The Flintstones is not really where we want to be.
No, exactly.
Okay, I want to segue, as you would have done in your job at the Pentagon, where all of a sudden the boss says, okay, so much for cyber, now tell me about Syria.
Right.
Arab Spring, this is something you've watched throughout your career. What's going on in Syria?
Well, in Syria, it's a very interesting case. We're kind of like with all of the revolutions that we observe from a historical perspective, we're at kind of that intermediate stage.
We're watching some footage right now of what's going on.
Exactly, and when you look at what's going on there, you see, there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of what we in the military would call kinetic action,
right.
But there's also a lot of politics in the background. For example, there's something known as the Free Syrian Army, and that Free Syrian Army is one of those areas that it's made up of folks that are not loyal to al-Assad anymore, and what they're doing is they're going in and they're actually creating the baseline for a rebel army. Now, whether they'll be successful or not depends on a lot of things. For example, how much support are they going to get from other countries, like Turkey, for example. Turkey is very interested in toppling the current al-Assad regime, but they are also very reluctant to do that for a number of reasons, to include their Kurdish problem. And so there are many, many issues there, but from a human rights perspective and from an Iranian connection perspective, Syria is one of the key bad actors that it would be in our interests
to see a regime change of some sort. Not necessarily that we go make the regime change.
No, but we help them, we facilitate, we do those kinds of things that make it more tenable for a new regime like that to work.
Okay, I have one quick question, then we have to go to a break. Joseph Lenners has Twittered us in and wants me to ask you a question. What level of cyber attack would force or drive a real response from the United States? Now, it's presumably not just the water supply in Springfield, Illinois.
Right. It would have to be something very catastrophic. Lives would have to be lost, or the potential of lives being lost would trigger something like that. One of the key things that I should point out is that the current DoD cyber strategy does not really talk, at least in its public form, about an offensive action. And there may be some reasons for that, but it's also a missed opportunity in my view, because we need to be able to go in and actually say, these are the things that we need to do, and we need to be able to warn people that we can do them.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Colonel Leighton, for your first appearance on Defcon 3, and you were terrific, so you have to come back.
Thank you very much, KT.